Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading Chapter 5 of Queen of Sorcery by David Eddings, Book 2 of the Polgara. And as always, you should buy the original book to support the original work. Chapter 5. The fire had burned down in a tiny orange flicker outside the tent, and the forest around the clearing was silent. Garion lay with a throbbing head, trying to sleep. Finally, long past midnight, he gave it up. He slid out from under his blanket and went searching for Aunt Paul. Above the silvery fog, a full moon had risen, and its light made the mist luminous. The air around him seemed almost to glow as he picked his way carefully through the silent camp. He scratched on the outside of her tent flap and whispered, "Aunt Paul?" There was no answer. "Aunt Paul?" he whispered a bit louder. "It's me, Garion. May I come in?" There was still no answer, nor even the faintest sound. Carefully, he pulled back the flap and peered inside. The tent was empty. Puzzled, even a bit alarmed, he turned and looked around the clearing. Hedar stood watch not far from the picketed horses, his hawk face turned toward the foggy forest, and his cape drawn about him. Garion hesitated a moment, and then stepped quietly behind the tents. He angled down through the trees and the filmy, luminous fog toward the brook, thinking that if he bathed his aching head in cold water, it might help. He was about 50 yards from the tents when he saw a faint movement among the trees ahead. He stopped. A huge gray wolf padded out of the fog and stopped in the center of a small open space among the trees. Garion drew in his breath sharply and froze beside a large twisted oak. The wolf sat down on the damp leaves as if he were waiting for something. The glowing fog illuminated details Garion would not have been able to see on an ordinary night. The wolf's rough shoulders were silvery, and his muzzle was shot with gray. He carried his age with enormous dignity, and his yellow eyes seemed calm and very wise somehow. Garion stood absolutely still. He knew that the slightest sound would instantly reach the sharp ears of the wolf, but it was more than that. The blow behind his ear had made him lightheaded, and the strange glow of moon-drenched fog made this encounter seem somehow unreal. He found that he was holding his breath. A large, snowy white owl swooped over the open space among the trees on ghosting wings, settled on a low branch, and perched there, looking down at the wolf with an unblinking stare. The gray wolf looked calmly back at the perched bird. Then, though there was no breath of wind, it seemed somehow that a sudden eddy in the shimmering fog made the figure of the owl and the wolf hazy and indistinct. When it cleared again, Mr. Wolf stood in the center of the opening, and Aunt Paul, in her gray gown, was seated rather sedately on the limb above him. "It's been a long time since we've hunted together, Polgara," the old man said. "Yes, it has, Father." She raised her arms and pushed her fingers through the long, dark weight of her hair. "I'd almost forgotten what it was like." She seemed to shudder then, with a strange kind of pleasure. "It's a very good night for it." "A little damp," he replied, shaking one foot. "It's very clear above the treetops, and the stars are particularly bright. It's a splendid night for flying." "I'm glad you enjoyed yourself. Did you happen to remember what you were supposed to be doing?" "Don't be sarcastic, Father." "Well?" "There's no one in the vicinity but errands, and most of them are asleep." "You're sure?" "Of course. There isn't a Grolem for 5 leagues in any direction." "Did you find the ones you were looking for?" "They weren't hard to follow," Wolf answered. "They're staying in a cave about 3 leagues deeper into the forest. Another one of them died on their way back there, and a couple more probably won't live until morning. The rest of them seemed a little bitter about the way things turned out." "I can imagine. Did you get close enough to hear what they were saying? He nodded. There's a man in one of the villages nearby who watches the road and lets them know when somebody passes by who might be worth robbing. When they're just ordinary thieves? Not exactly. They were watching for us in particular. We'd all been described to them in rather complete detail. I think I'll go talk to this villager, she said grimly. She flexed her fingers in an unpleasantly suggestive manner. It's not worth the time it would take, Wolf told her, scratching thoughtfully at his beard. All he'd be able to tell you is that some Murgo offered him gold. Grolms don't bother to explain very much to their hirelings. We should attend to him, Father, she insisted. We don't want him lurking behind us, trying to buy up every brigand in Erendia to send after us. After tomorrow, he won't buy much of anything, Wolf replied with a short laugh. His friends plan to lure him out into the woods in the morning and cut his throat for him, among other things. Good. I'd like to know who the Grolm is, though. Wolf shrugged. What difference does it make? There are dozens of them in northern Erendia, all stirring up much trouble as they can. They know what's coming as well as we do. We can't expect them to just sit back and let us pass. Shouldn't we put a stop to it? We don't have the time, he said. It takes forever to explain things to errands. If we move fast enough, maybe we can slip by before the Grolms are ready. And if we can't, then we'll do it the other way. I've got to go get to Zidar before he crosses into the Cathal Murgos. If too many things get in my way, I'll have to be more direct. You should have done that from the beginning, Father. Sometimes you're too delicate about things. Are you going to start that again? That's always your answer to everything, Polgara. You're forever fixing things that would fix themselves if you just leave them alone, and changing things that they don't have to be changed. Don't be cross, Father. Help me down. Why not fly down, he suggested. Don't be absurd. Garion slipped away among the mossy trees, trembling violently as he went. When Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf returned to the clearing, they roused the others. I think we'd better move on, Wolf told him. We're a little vulnerable out here. It's safer on the highway, and I'd like to go past this particular stretch of woods. The dismantling of their night's encampment took less than an hour, and they started back along the woodcutter's track toward the Great West Road. Though it was still some hours before dawn, the moon-bathed fog filled the night with misty luminosity, and it seemed almost as if they rode through a shining cloud that had settled among the dark trees. They reached the highway and turned south again. I'd like to be a good way from here when the sun comes up, Wolf said quietly, but we don't want to blunder into anything, so keep your eyes and ears open. They set off at a canter and had covered a good 3 leagues by the time the fog had begun to turn a pearly gray with the approach of morning. As they rounded a broad curve, Hedar suddenly raised his arm, signaling for a halt. What's wrong? Varric asked him. Horses ahead, Hedar replied. Coming this way. Are you sure? I don't hear anything. 40 at least, Hedar answered firmly. There, Durnik said, his eyes cocked to one side. Hear that? Faintly, they all heard a jingling clatter some distance off in the fog. We could hide in the woods until they've passed, Leldarin suggested. It's better to stay on the road, Wolf replied. Let me handle it, Silk said confidently, moving into the lead. I've done this sort of thing before. They proceeded at a careful walk. The riders, who emerged from the fog, were encased in steel. They wore full suits of polished armor and round helmets with pointed visors that made them look strangely like huge insects. They carried long lances with colored pennons at their tips, and their horses were massive beasts also encased in armor. Mimrite knights, Leldarin snarled, his eyes going flat. Keep your feelings to yourself, Wolf told the young man. If any of them say anything to you, answer in such a way that they'll think you're a Mimbrate sympathizer, like your young Barentane back in your uncle's house. Leldarin's face hardened. as he tells you, Eldrin, Aunt Paul said. This isn't the time for heroics. Hold! The leader of the armored column commanded, lowering his lance until the steel point was leveled at them. Let one come forward so that I might speak with him. The knight's tone was peremptory. Silk moved toward the steel-cased man, his smile ingratiating. We're glad to see you, Sir Knight, he lied glibly. We were set upon by robbers last night, and we've been riding in fear of our lives. What is thy name? The knight demanded, raising his visor. And who are these who accompany thee? I am Radek of Baktor, my lord, Silk answered, bowing and pulling off his velvet cap. A merchant of Drasnia, bound for Talhaneth, with Sandarian woolens in hopes of catching the winter market. The armored man's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Thy party seems overlarge for so simple an undertaking, worthy merchant. The three there are my servants, Silk told him, pointing at Barak, Hadar, and Dernick. The old man and the boy serve my sister, a widow of independent means, who accompanies me so that she might visit Talhaneth. What of the other? The knight pressed. The Asturian. A young nobleman traveling to Vomimber to visit friends there. He graciously consented to guide us through this forest. The knight's suspicions seemed to relax a bit. Thou madest mention of robbers, he said. Where did this ambush take place? About 3 or 4 leagues back. They set upon us after we had made our night's encampment. We managed to beat them off, but my sister was terrified. The province of Asturia seethes with rebellion and brigandage, the knight said sternly. My men and I are sent to suppress such offenses. Come here, Asturian. Eldrin's nostrils flared, but he obediently came forward. I will require thy name of thee. My name is Leldarin, Sir Knight. How may I serve thee? These robbers thy friends spoke of, were they commons or men of quality? Serfs, my lord, Leldarin replied, ragged and uncouth, doubtless fled from lawful submission to their masters to take up outlawry in the forest. How may we expect duty and proper submission from serfs when nobles raise detestable rebellion against the crown? The knight asserted. Truly, my lord, Leldarin agreed with a show of sadness that was a trifle overdone. Much have I argued that self-same point with those who speak endlessly of membrane oppression and overweening arrogance. My appeals for reason and dutiful respect for his majesty, our lord king, however, are greeted with desertion and cold despite. He sighed. Thy wisdom becomes thee, young Leldarin, the knight approved. Regrettably, I must detain thee and thy companions in order that we may verify certain details. Sir Knight, Silk protested vigorously, a change in the weather could destroy the value of my merchandise in Talhaneth. I pray you, don't delay me. I regret the necessity, good merchant, the knight replied, but Asturia is filled with dissemblers and plotters. I cannot permit none to pass without meticulous examination. There was a stir at the rear of the membrane column. In a single file, resplendent and burnished breastplates, plumed helmets, and crimson capes, 100 Talnedran legionnaires rode slowly along the flank of the armored knights. What seems to be the problem here? The legion commander, a lean, leather-faced man of 40 or so, asked politely as he stopped not so far from Silk's horse. We do not require the assistance of the legions in this matter, the knight said coldly. Our orders are from Vomimber. We are sent to help restore order in Astoria, and we were questioning these travelers to that end. I have a great respect for orders, Sir Knight, the Talnedran replied, but the security of the highway is my responsibility. He looked inquiringly at Silk. I am Radek of Baktor, Captain, Silk told him. A Drasnian merchant bound for Talhaneth. I have documents if you wish to see them.
documents are easily forged, the knight declared. So they are, the Talnidran agreed. But to save time, I make it a practice to accept all documents at face value. A Drasnian merchant with goods in his packs has a legitimate reason to be on an imperial highway, Sir Knight. There's no reason to detain him, is there? We seek to stamp out banditry and rebellion, the knight asserted hotly.
Stamp away, the captain said, but off the highway, if you don't mind. By treaty, the Imperial Highway is Talnidran territory. What you do once you're 50 yards back in the trees is your affair. What happens on this road is mine. I'm certain that no true Mimbrate knight would want to humiliate his king by violating a solemn agreement between the Arendish crown and the Emperor of Talnidra, would he? The knight looked at him helplessly. I think you should proceed, good merchant, the Talnidran told Silk. I know that all Talhoneth awaits your arrival breathlessly. Silk grinned at him and bowed flurriedly in his saddle. Then he gestured to the others, and they all rode slowly past the fuming Mimbrate knight. After they had passed, the legionnaires closed ranks along the highway, effectively cutting off any pursuit. Good man there, Beric said. I don't think much of Talnidrans ordinarily, but that one's different. Let's get moving right along, Mr. Wolf said. I'd rather not have those knights doubling back on after the Talnidrans leave. They pushed their horses into a gallop and rode on, leaving the knights behind, arguing heatedly, with the Legion commander in the middle of the road. They stayed that night at a thick-walled Talnidran hostel, and for perhaps the first time in his life, Garion bathed without the insistence or even the suggestion of his aunt. Though he had not had the chance to become directly involved in the fight in the clearing the night before, he felt somehow as if he were splattered with blood or worse. He had not before realized how grotesquely men could be mutilated in close fighting. Watching a living man disemboweled or brained had filled him with a kind of deep shame that the ultimate inner secrets of the human body could be so grossly exposed. He felt unclean. He removed his clothing in the chilly bathhouse, and even without thinking, the silver amulet Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul had given him, and then he entered the steaming tub, where he scrubbed at his skin with a coarse brush and strong soap, much harder than even the most meticulous obsession with personal cleanliness would have required. For the next several days, they moved southward at a steady pace, stopping each night at the evenly spaced Talnidran hostels, where the presence of the hard-faced legionnaires was a continual reminder that all the might of the Imperial Talnidra guaranteed the safety of travelers who sought refuge there. On the 6th day after the fight in the forest, however, Leldarin's horse pulled up lame. Dernick and Hedar, under Aunt Paul's supervision, spent several hours brewing poultices over a small fire by the roadside and applying steaming compresses to the animal's leg, while Wolf fumed at the delay. By the time the horse was fit to continue, they all realized that there was no chance to reach the next hostel before dark. Well, old Wolf, Aunt Paul said after they had remounted, what now? Do we ride on at night, or do we try to take shelter in the forest again? I haven't decided, Wolf answered shortly. If I remember right, there's a village not far ahead, Leldarin, now mounted on an Algar horse, stated. It's a poor place, but I think it has an inn of sorts. That sounds ominous, Silk said. What exactly do you mean by of sorts? The lord of this demons is notoriously greedy, Leldarin replied. His taxes are crushing, and his people have little left for themselves. The inn isn't very good. We'll have to chance it, Wolf decided, and led them off at a brisk trot. As they approached the village, the heavy clouds began to clear off, and the sun broke through wanly. The village was even worse than Eldarin's description had led them to believe.
A half-dozen ragged beggars stood in the mud on the outskirts, their hands held out imploringly and their voices shrill. The houses were nothing more than rude hovels oozing smoke from the pitiful fires within. Scrawny pigs rooted in the muddy streets, and the stench of the place was awful. A funeral procession slogged through the mud toward the burial ground on the other side of the village. The corpse, carried on a board, was wrapped in a ragged brown blanket, and the richly robed and cowled priests of Chaldan, the Erendish god, chanted an age-old hymn that had much to do with war and vengeance, but little to do with comfort. The widow, a whimpering infant at her breast, followed the body, her face blank and her eyes dead. The inn smelled of stale beer and half-rotten food. A fire had destroyed one end of the common room, charring and blackening the low-beamed ceiling. The gaping hole in the burned wall was curtained off with a sheet of rotting canvas. The fire pit in the center of the room smoked, and the hard-faced innkeeper was surly. For supper, he offered only bowls of watery gruel, a mixture of barley and turnips. "Charming," Silk said sardonically, pushing away his untouched bowl. "I'm a bit surprised at you, Leldarin. Your passion for correcting wrongs seemed to have overlooked this place. Might I suggest that your next crusade include a visit to the lord of this Demesne? His hanging seems long overdue." "I hadn't realized it was so bad," Leldarin replied in a subdued voice. He looked around as if seeing certain things for the first time. A kind of sick horror began to show itself in his transparent face. Garion, his stomach churning, stood up. "I think I'll go outside," he declared. "Not too far," Aunt Paul warned. The air outside was at least somewhat cleaner, and Garion picked his way carefully toward the edge of the village, trying to avoid the worst of the mud. "Please, my lord," a little girl with huge eyes begged, "have you a crust of bread to spare?" Garion looked at her helplessly. I'm sorry." He fumbled through his clothes, looking for something to give her, but the child began to cry and turned away. In the stump-dotted field beyond the stinking streets, a ragged boy about Garion's own age was playing a wooden flute as he watched a few scrubby cows. The melody he played was heartbreakingly pure, drifting unnoticed among the hovels, squatting in the slanting rays of the pale sun. The boy saw him, but did not break off his playing. Their eyes met with a kind of grave recognition, but they did not speak. At the edge of the forest beyond the field, a dark-robed and hooded man astride a black horse came out of the trees and sat watching the village. There was something ominous about the dark figure, and something vaguely familiar as well. It seemed somehow to Garion that he should know who the rider was, but, though his mind groped for a name, it tantalizingly eluded him. He looked at the figure at the edge of the woods for a long time, noticing, without even being aware of it, that, though the horse and rider stood in the full light of the setting sun, there was no shadow behind them. Deep in his mind, something tried to shriek at him, but all bemused, he merely watched. He would not say anything to Aunt Paul or the others about the figure at the edge of the woods, because there was nothing to say. As soon as he turned his back, he would forget. The light began to fade, and because he had begun to shiver, he turned to go back to the inn with the aching song of the boy's flute soaring toward the sky above him.